It's always good to hear you, Ruth. And, I just, the thing is, one of the things I think that's a really important cornerstone that Ruth just demonstrates is just that openness and vulnerability that's needed in order for us to be able to live in a place of well-being. And I think that's a real challenge for those of us who are in ministry. It's sometimes hard to find places and appropriate ways of being vulnerable. And I think, one of the things that really comes across to me in Ruth's journey is she shares that I think it really gives us permission to really get in contact with ourselves and really be honest about what's going on. So, as ever, Ruth, thank you for that. And also, I just want to thank you all for allowing me to be here. I feel so blessed by being here, just in those prayers this morning. It was, I've got a lot to do at the moment, and just being led into that space with you all together it's just been such a blessing to me. I feel really ministered to. So just thank you for being able to be part of this with you. And as part of this, I hope we'll be able to explore some of the things that are sort of driving well-being and some of the reasons why maybe we should be considering it. But I just do a little introduction to who I am. I've been working with Sanctuary only since August, and it's a charity that's set up in Canada in 2012. And essentially, the role of Sanctuary is to equip you as the church to become more effective in your response to mental health in your community and build well-being together. So it's great to be in a position where I've sort of got such what feels like a really positive role. I'm here to bring resources. I'm here to offer training and connection, and where I can support to your journey as you respond to that within often what's a very complex area. My background is, I think, probably a bit like Ruth. Really, my own well-being has been has driven me here and the need for it. So. My background, I spent 20 years working with homeless people. And, one of the things that I found in that is that I found both kind of the resilience and the woundedness of people and the kind of wonder of both of those things as I work with those who are homeless. I'm doing that in London. I'm based here. Where I am sitting at the moment, I'm in King's Cross, so it's remarkably quiet. You probably wouldn't know it by where I am, but we're in this quite peaceful part of the world, within the hubbub of this massive city. But my life for 20 years was working with homeless people. And inevitably, you're amazed and also horrified by the impact of homelessness on those who are working in it. And also, those of you who've been involved in ministry will probably know this experience of those times that you feel overstretched and at the end of yourself are often the times that you need to do things differently, as Ruth has demonstrated. And so my journey with homelessness very, very much kind of brought me to a point of thinking I need to do things differently. I really do, in order to be healthy. And I started, partly my church situation is I'm in an Anglican church that's on the estate that I live on in King's Cross. A lot of people are part of that church have got quite big struggles in their life, and I would imagine there aren't too many differences between the struggles that they face and that of many members of your congregation in the context of South Wales. There's a lot going on in terms of debt, ongoing poverty, real challenges around relationships and these sorts of things. And so in order for this to be a sustainable environment, I was starting to think, well, I think there's something more that we need to be looking at as a community. And some of the learning that I'd started to kind of move into, really from necessity of feeling a bit at the end of my rope, I started to try and explore that with others. And that led me to working for a charity called Livability that I was working with for 5 years, where we were looking to resource the church in many different ways, but wellbeing was part of what we were doing. So that's just a little bit of background on me. Now, you've heard that for a bit. Now, I'm going to ask you just to indulge me for a moment. Now, one of the things that sometimes makes it hard to kind of, in the context of a long Zoom call, is the fact that we're just sitting down. And so if you feel you can and you want to, I just want to encourage you to do what I would call a stretch, a wriggle and a yawn. And you can do that in whatever way you want to. It basically, the whole point of this is just to kind of become a bit aware of your body, recognizing that if you put a bit of energy into your body, then the likelihood you might be more responsive, and that takes the weight off me. Well, that's the idea. So it's really simple. Stretch, wriggle and yawn. I'm going to stand up to do it. If you want to sit down, you can. And we'll just take a moment just to do a stretch, a wriggle and a yawn, okay? So stretch. Oh. There we are. And wriggle like that. And while you're standing up, just yawn with your hands out if you want to. And hopefully, just when you've taken a moment to do that, you'll have just felt, hopefully you'll feel a little bit of sensation in your body. You'll be aware of kind of yourself as a fully embodied human being. We're not just a brain, but there's more to us than that. And within that as well, within something like that, it just, my hope is that it just makes us a little bit aware of what we're feeling, what we're bringing when we encounter this topic of well-being. So, what I'm hoping to do is kind of take us on a bit of a journey around well-being within the time that we've got. There are going to be three areas that we're going to be looking at. And I hope that within it, we'll be unpacking some theology around this that will give a bit of historical context as well within what I would say is historical thought on well-being and how some of the things in the Bible sort of overlap with some of the historical ideas around well-being. Then we're going to be looking at some of the contemporary ideas and how this might impact. But within it, I hope that there'll be something there for each one of you that you think, oh yeah, that's something I'd like to take away, and that's something I can either dig into and think more about, or it's something I might be able to practically consider. So now we've done that little physical kind of warm-up, I want to invite you to something else for a moment now. So I've got a question for you. And I'm just going to do a quick screen share here, which will hopefully, in one moment, give you the slide that I'm hoping for. So here we go. Hopefully you can see some weather there on the screen. And my question for you this morning is what is your internal weather looking like this morning? Okay, so I'll just let that land for a moment. So just think about that. So is the sun shining like in the top left of the screen? Is it cloudy with a chink of light? Maybe there's a storm brewing, or maybe you know this is the calm after the storm that you're experiencing. So just have a think as you look at that image. What does your internal weather feel like this morning? Take a moment. Think about where am I on that? And what I'd encourage you to do is not to kind of judge where you're at, but just acknowledge it. Just think, okay, well, that's where I am this morning, and that's okay. That's what I'm bringing. That's how I'm present this morning. And just thinking about that question of where you are. And again, it's just recognizing we can only ever bring who we are and what we've got to anything like this. But a level of honesty about what we're actually feeling could be really helpful. And oftentimes I think we can press things down, push things away. And often in our roles in life, we're expected to do that. But that can sometimes come at a cost. And so the idea of just checking in with yourself in this way, and thinking about your internal weather, allows you to be honest and be okay with it. You know, just recognize that there are all things going on, many different conflicting priorities that we're trying to manage in our lives. And yet we can be present in this moment in the way that we're doing. So I'll just stop sharing that screen for a moment, and we'll talk a bit more about well-being. So, well-being, it's a bit of a tricky word, isn't it? It's tricky for lots of reasons, I think. One of the things that's tricky about it is that it can be quite hard to put your finger on it. You know, it's a difficult one. So as I was thinking about well-being, it kind of made me think that, well, actually, can we come up with a definition of it? When as an idea did it first arrive? Is there something that, you know, we can point to that that was the moment when we thought, oh yeah, that's well-being. It's come into public consciousness. Now, as I was thinking about that, I was thinking, oh, okay, what do we associate with well-being? And, you know, did well-being arrive the first time that someone kind of put some candles by their bath Was that the moment that well-being arrived? Put rose petals in it and had a lovely time by themselves. Was it the first time perhaps that somebody, I don't know, decided to go on a romantic mini break, and that was first advertised? When did well-being arrive? Was it a time perhaps when, I don't know, when somebody went on their first yoga retreat? Was that the time that well-being arrived? Or if we dig back even further, was it the time when, you know, the Americans founded their constitution and they gave the right to all their citizens to pursue happiness? That's had a big impact on all of us, hasn't it, culturally? Or even further back, maybe controversially, did well-being arrive when the Buddha first meditated? So a few people probably be a bit uncomfortable with that, and I would be. So the thing about this, of course, is that widespread, it's such well-being is such a widespread term. It's really subjective, and it comes with huge amounts of baggage. And even in that little list there, we'll see that there are a few things that are a kind of, well, it offers almost this polarity on one hand of these different kinds of connotations. And it sometimes feels a bit like, for some of us, well-being, if it was a person coming to visit our house who knew we were Christians and wanted to be respectful, it would turn up saying, Jesus is cool, but where can I hang this dream catcher? You know, it's a bit like that. It does that a little bit. Or it could be the kind of guest that when it leaves your house, you're not quite sure whether the smell that it leaves behind is one of incense, one of expensive soap, or maybe something that's a bit stronger and you're not quite sure is fully legal. You know, that's well-being. It kind of comes in this little bit of a haze, and it's uncertain. But really, are there other things to well-being? Well, I think there's another thing that well-being sometimes seems to offer us within the public consciousness, and that's that it seems to say, listen, you're stressed, aren't you? Listen, there's something I can give you for that. Just pony up the cash and you'll be fine. And that's another thing that well-being sometimes seems to do. It seems to be pretty focused on trying to sell us things. So we've got these different problems really with it, sometimes feeling a bit unclear and keeping company that we might feel uncomfortable with and maybe seems a bit dodgy, you know, uncertain of its origin. And then on the other hand, it just seems to be something that's increasingly commercialized. So no wonder that many of us feel that there's not an easy fit for it within our church communities. But what I'd like us to do now is just pan out a little. So I've got an image for you here just to see. And I'm panning out as far as I can possibly go on this. And there we go. We can't really pan out much further than that, can we? So let's gain a bit of perspective as we look at that image there. So just looking at that image. Now, we've got the picture that was taken during the Apollo 17 mission. Now, I don't know if anyone's got a memory of that. It was just before I was born, so I don't, but I definitely grew up with this image, as many of us did. And it's, for those of us that grew up with it, I think it's quite hard to recognise the impact of it when it was first taken. But for many people, one of the big things that came with this image was this idea that every single one of us on this beautiful blue dot was on it together. And we might take for granted that we're all aware of that now, but in 1972, this was a revolutionary idea. And that sense perhaps of connectedness and awe that came with it. And it changed for a time the way that people see each other. If we pan back even further and look at this perhaps through our lens as Christians, as we look at that planet and the planet that we're on, I think there are a couple of truths that are really important that we approach this by. And firstly, one, it was declared good, and not just good, but very good when God created it. And this huge affirmation of the creation, it's a really good starting point, I think, on this topic of well-being. And it was a really good starting point for God. In fact, it was one of the first things he said and spoke into this. Secondly, there's another important truth, and that's that it was created by God and for God, with Jesus, the Logos, at the centre. And as we're told in the first chapter of Colossians, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Now, whilst we hold both of these truths about the creation of our planet, we might see its beauty in that picture. We might find, if we reflect, beauty tinged with some of the hurt and the difficulty that comes with being human. We might remember some of the hopes and the aspirations and the needs of those people who are on this planet. You know, all of those things may be bound up as we look at that image. And also, we might be thinking, okay, well, if these are all things that are common to us, I'd like to suggest that maybe from the beginning of time, that every one of us on the little blue dot that we just looked at, has been asking ourselves the key question in one way or another. And that key question is, what makes a good life? What makes a good life? You know, I think that's something that is common to us all. And when we perhaps get through that kind of the initial business of how do we feed ourselves, how do we shelter ourselves, it doesn't take long as civilization for us to be looking at that question together. There's a second question that we could look at, which would be, well, you know, why is that? But first of all, let's have a look at this deeper question of what makes for a good life. So what I'd like to do is just kind of really brief overview of like some really kind of key tenets of the ancient religions, and then we're going to look to philosophy as the way that's influenced us. So pre-modern religions were really addressing this question. And I think, you know, again, when we've covered those basics and we're surviving, it becomes a much more pressing question. And so if we look at kind of the key religions, we'll see different answers to that question, you know, what makes for a good life? And I would like to reframe that even in this question of what does it mean to flourish? What does it mean to flourish? Which I think is something that quite quickly we moved into. So the shorthand responses to that would be this. Well, Buddhism, for example, is going to offer, it would say that the way to flourish is to end suffering in this life. So that's kind of primarily what Buddhism's offering in this question. Islam primarily, not exclusively, but primarily is offering flourishing in the afterlife. That's kind of primarily what it wants to do, okay? Other things too, but that's the primary thing it offers. Judaism is different in that it offers flourishing through God. That's what it's saying. It's saying basically the way to live a good life is through God. And so already we can see that's edging towards something that probably feels a bit more familiar for us, okay? So I think as civilization continues and develops, the question of flourishing becomes more and more important. And I'm indebted to the work of a Baptist scholar, actually, American, called Jonathan Pennington, who's traced a lot of the history of this thinking. I really recommend him. He's studied at St Andrews, and he's unpacked quite a lot of the deeper theology around well-being that we start to see in the Bible. Now we're going to just jump to the ancient Greeks, who were really interested in this question of what does it mean to flourish, and the different schools of Greek philosophy really committed to this. They wanted to look at, well, what is it to kind of live a life well, and they came up with this word that kind of accomplished and encompassed all of this idea of human flourishing, called eudaimonia. Okay, eudaimonia is this concept of the state of human flourishing, and all of the different schools of thought of Greek philosophy looked at this. Everything, Epicureans, Stoics, all of these people were looking into this question deeply. They had different answers to it, but that's what they were interested in. So perhaps most influential, and probably still very influential in terms of our modern age, would be someone like Aristotle. And he comprehensively explored this and provided a framework for it. And his conclusion to this question of what is it to flourish was, for him, it was found in excellence, this idea of kind of the pursuit of all that is good. And so that's important for us because a lot of our kind of modern societies is founded on this idea of virtue ethics. And even recently it's had a real resurgence, you know, even outside of, you know, its influence on Christianity. And it has some, I think there's a lot of value in virtue ethics. But even outside of that, people are very interested in this question of what is it to live well? What is excellence? And so Aristotle as someone who really kind of drove that question. And eudaimonia for him was in excellence. It was this idea of kind of really pursuing excellence in all things. So pretty good. It's a helpful thing. We could probably all subscribe to that to a degree or another. And that held sway as a concept until probably the 18th century. And then things started to change with the Enlightenment. So let me do a little screen share, because we've got someone who's particularly influential for us here. And there we are. Here we have Immanuel Kant. And that's Aristotle. And interestingly enough, even though it's been a number of centuries since Aristotle was thought was developed, Kant was probably the person that really turned things on their head the most. And he really rejected this idea of eudaimonia. So all of that Greek thought that had been really influencing how we were looking at the word until that point, through a rationalistic lens that the Enlightenment brought, he really critiqued it. And he said, no, this shouldn't be, this idea of human flourishing, eudaimonia as the highest goal is not the way forward. He said, actually, what we should be doing, we should be working towards altruism. So you'll see the word there. And he said that's, giving for the good of oneself. That's the better place to be. But this idea of kind of eudaimonia, no, it's lesser. Self-giving, altruistic approach to life, that's the way that things should be. So that's what he offered in all of this. And now the reason you might be thinking, well, hang on, why are you showing this? Well, it's more than background noise, actually, because all of these things do influence us societally, and inevitably they have an impact on where we're at in terms of how we approach things from a Christian view. So with this in the background, you're probably thinking, okay, when are we going to get to the theology? Well, now's the bit, we're going to get to that. This question of kind of what does it mean to flourish as a human being? Within the Old Testament, there are three concepts that we look at, and they transfer very handily into the New Testament in terms of the Greek as well. These three concepts that are foundations for this. So here's a framework that I just want to offer you. Once again, let me just share what I've got here. So we'll move on from Kant. And so here we are. We've got there are three concepts here that we're going to look at that parallel, and I'm just going to unpack those a little. So first of all, we've got shalom, and that's the one that you'll have heard referred to, and I would imagine for many of you this feels like a fairly familiar concept, and that's one that's probably been impacted in different places. And this idea of shalom, this concept of prosperity and wholeness, this idea of person and society in alignment, it's kind of an umbrella term, if you like, which speaks of strength, of longevity, this idea of a state of well-being, of living in communion with God, okay? So we might associate it with peace, and that's, part of it. But this idea of the absence of conflict or inner serenity, they're the benefits of shalom. They're the benefits of it, not intrinsically about it. It's much more about this whole idea of wellness, wholeness, and flourishing. And it's the idea of shalom it's God's entire redemptive work in the Bible. So, at the heart of it, you've got this idea, and thinking about kind of the lion lying down with the lamb, as we see this full vision of this in Isaiah 11, for example, this idea of God's restoration for us. And also, again, in Isaiah, in chapter 32, which describes the time of the Spirit being poured out, making all the land fruitful, and this results in justice and righteousness and peace. And so by the time we reach the New Testament, we can see that this concept of shalom is present in this idea of eirene. And so, but the thing about this, and the crucial factor of this within the New Testament, of course, is that it's a fuller outworking through the work of Jesus. So this flourishing and well-being basically being ultimately the function of God's saving work through Christ. Okay, so those two concepts are really important in terms of how we understand this theologically. Now, the second of this, in the Old Testament, it's known as ashrei. And now, it's a less well-known one, but this translates as blessing. And this is it, but actually the reality is there's more than that. So it's not just I receive a blessing, but it's more of a flourishing. It's more like, if you like, kind of you know, the result of the blessing on someone who is in this state of ashrei. And it's what you say about someone who's in this state of kind of wholeness. It's not this idea of explicit divine favor, but a universal concept of God caring about human flourishing. This idea that God really cares that we flourish. That's ashrei. And this comes in the form in the New Testament of makarios. And we see makarios prominently in the Beatitudes. So if you look at Matthew 5, for example, this idea of the blessed are phrases, you might even want to translate those are flourishing are, you know, flourishing are. Now, the other thing about makarios that's quite a nice little detail is that at the time, this particular Greek word, it's the same understanding in common parlance as eudaimonia. You'll remember that from earlier. So, you know, it's almost interchangeable, that idea of flourishing. But, you know, it's much, Jesus using that word of makarios, you know, this idea of being blessed. It's a very different kind of blessing, isn't it? If you're saying flourishing are the poor, and what does that mean? It brings a challenge, doesn't it, to this idea of kind of just those who perhaps are monetarily or materially healthy, you know, healthy and have resources at their hands. So it's a kind of a beautiful idea, and then we've got this idea of tamim. And now tamim, the idea of tamim, it's more associated, if you like, with holiness. Okay, so it communicates this idea of kind of integrity, wholeness, what it means to be godly and flourishing. And so if you want a reference for that, say in 1 Kings 9. And by the time, many others here, but by the time we reach the New Testament, tamim can be seen in teleos. Okay, I missed the S off my thing there, but stick an S on the end in your mind. And so teleos is a lovely idea of this kind of development of this idea of wholeheartedness for God, as it were. And so, for example, in Matthew 5, that might translate, and 5 verse 48 would translate as, be teleos as your heavenly Father is teleos. That makes sense. So I hope what we're getting here with these three things are a kind of a really, really rich concept of different elements of well-being and how that might relate. So hopefully, I hope that might be giving us some firm foundations for God's interest in our flourishing. Yeah, that's the whole point of doing this detailed work. And if you like to dig deeper, again, John Pennington's the man to follow up. There's some really wonderful stuff that he's done there. But equally, I think it's not really just enough for us to know that this is something that God seems, you know, is interested in, and he's a concern in. So otherwise, I think we can end up just being in a place where we can look at the Greeks and say, well, that's all good. It's, you know, we can assent to that. We can even think about, yeah, altruism from as we've seen from Kant, that seems like a good thing. But there's actually something more, isn't there, in terms of how we live this stuff out, and something very, very important in terms of our distinctive. And our secret weapon, everyone, this is the big reveal, is love. Excellent. That's the secret weapon. And the reason why this is such an important thing within this discussion is because when the New Testament was formed, and there was all this kind of Greek thought going on, even before and after, love as central to the gospel was a huge challenge to both kind of ancient and modern era philosophy. And Christians, in their outworking of that, in showing mercy, in making peace, in offering kindness, were offering something really radical. And Paul's statement that love was at the centre of this faith was a real game changer, and also it was a leveller, of course, on a societal basis. You know, neither Greek nor Jew, slave or free. And this idea of flourishing for all, with love at the centre of it. So we're not just being given a vision, I think, of how things should be, but the other thing, of course, there's another second kind of special secret here, is that we have the means to human flourishing. Okay. And that's that we receive something outside of ourselves, which of course is the Holy Spirit. So that's really important in terms of our distinctive. And I just really want to kind of emphasize that in terms of kind of, because there are all so many great things that we can be doing, different practices that will help align us and help us feel better. But that truth of the Spirit at work in us is so fundamental in terms of how we understand flourishing. It's not just getting the ethics right, but in reality, of course, the work of the Spirit is much, much bigger. And, you know, fundamentally as human beings, we have a heart change problem. And the reality, of course, that nothing is possible in the kingdom of God without the power of the Spirit working within us. We're not just a bunch of ideas, but, you know, and love isn't just a concept, but it's a fully embodied way of being. And we come embodied just as Jesus did. And through his Spirit, we can love. And it's only really through that that's possible, you know, that our imperfect love becomes something much greater than the sum of its parts. I'm going to bounce to eschatology. I don't know if you've dug into that word recently, but this again is a really important one in terms of how we understand well-being. Don't worry, I won't be taking us on a massive journey down a rabbit hole, but just a quick word on eschatology and well-being. I'm just going to do another quick screen share, and bear with me on this because I think there's a nice little summation here from Tom Wright that will help us, I think, understand this idea of kind of how eschatology is important. So I'm just going to read this quote out. So, the point of the resurrection is that the present bodily life is not valueless just because it will die. What you do with your body in the present matters because God has a great future in store for it by painting, preaching, singing, sewing, building hospitals, digging wells, campaigning for justice, writing poems, caring for the needy, loving your neighbour as yourself, and it will last into God's future. Here he is, man himself. These activities are not simply ways of making the present life more bearable until the day when we leave it behind altogether. They are part of what we may call building for God's kingdom. So we're getting that idea of this real breadth of what it means to kind of be flourishing within that illustration that Tom Wright has offered to us there. Something really rich in that, I think, for us as we consider it. So, you know, again, this kind of kingdom theology and this vision of shalom will not be new to many of you. But again, it's that sense in which this does go very broad, you know, it goes very broad in terms of kind of how we understand ourselves. And this idea, I guess, is this idea perhaps almost of us seeing ourselves as priests in the world to accomplish this flourishing, you know, or ministers, or, you know, disciples, whatever word works for you, people who are here to kind of accomplish, as it were, to shalom the whole world. And that's where the love comes in, of course, and that factor, that distinctive, which separates a truly biblical vision of human flourishing from just good principles, you know. Here's another quote, bear with me, it's another lengthy one. But C.S. Lewis has some really good ideas on this, and this is quite important in terms of this journey. So I'm just going to share this. So it's a lengthy one, but it's worth it. So just stick with me on this. Where's he gone? There he is. If you asked 20 good men today what they thought the highest of the virtues are, 19 of them would reply unselfishness. But if you asked almost any of the great Christians of old, he would have replied love. Do you see what's happened? A negative term has been substituted for a positive. The negative ideal of unselfishness carries with it the suggestion not primarily of securing good things for others, but of going without them ourselves, as if our abstinence and not their happiness was the important point. I do not think this is the Christian virtue of love. The New Testament has lots to say about self-denial, but not about self-denial as an end in itself. Indeed, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. So I wonder whether that's helpful in a way of seeing where flourishing starts to sit and where perhaps a bit of a realignment needs to take place. So let's really weed out this thin ideal of self-denial as an end in itself that I think probably Kant is to blame for. And instead, let's replace it with a spirit-filled love, which becomes more sustaining and therefore more sustainable. Yeah? And at this point, I think it's good to just bring in the Trinity, because again, just a short reference here for something that could be a much bigger exploration. Let's just have a look at this famous image. You'll have probably seen this many times. So again, within the Trinity here, we've got this idea of the Godhead in perfect relationship with one another. But of course, at the center of that, room for us at the table. And good Trinitarian theology emphasizes the relationship that God has with each other and the self-giving nature of the relationships within. Now, we don't have enough time really to explore the fullness of that, but this idea as mission, as participation with God, I think offers us a really strong underpinning of how we live as community, as ourselves, and how we're invited into God's relationship. This idea of God drawing near to us in such a way as to draw us near to himself within the circle of his knowing himself. Something really beautiful about that, and a recognizing that we are invited to be part of that. That's what we're participating in, yeah? So we participate in God's goodness. We're sustained by a relationship with him, and we're also co-creators with him. And there's something very beautiful about that as an image, I think, in terms of kind of feeling that the pressure isn't on us to generate, but actually, if anything, to come back to what Ruth was offering earlier on today, it's to come from that place of being, of really dwelling and being rooted. And that's the place where that then comes from. And I guess the question that we're all thinking about is that, you know, how then, you know, does this work out? You know, what does this look like within our communities? What might be the distinctive ways in which we can live this stuff out? So let's look at I think some contemporary thought around this. But before we do that, I just want to say, you know, you remember I began with almost this sort of stereotyped idea of well-being, like the idea of the Pamper days or the yoga retreat, you know, and also this idea of well-being as commodity or being a bit kind of esoteric. I think it's really important not to dismiss what is behind that, because I think for everyone that enters into that, there's a deep need for something sustainable that we're all looking for. And I think we, as Christians, we need to be careful not to just push those things away as ungodly, but we need, of course, to use our discernment in terms of which of those practices are good or not. But I think the stuff that draws people to them is really important, because I think the stuff that draws people to them, that deep desire, is very God-given. And so I think it's recognizing beneath some of those behaviors, or even some of the things themselves, that what we want to be seeing is that people are longing to flourish, and that's what we're created to be. So that's what I'm thinking when I name those things. That's, you know, it's very easy to kind of stereotype them, you know, the idea of someone going for a gong shower or, you know, whatever it might be. But beneath it, there's a deep desire for people to connect, to feel connected to themselves and others, and to feel healthy and good. And I think there's a challenge for all of us in terms of what it means to be healthy in our ministry. And there's often a big challenge in terms of how we make that sustainable. And the lives that we end up leading in ministry often seems to kind of push against that often. And so looking at ways in which we can do this together. And again, the model that Ruth offered earlier, this idea of something that's good for us and others, you know, suddenly becomes a lot more sustainable, you know, and it's not just giving out to self-sacrifice all the time, but we're doing things that are good for all of us. And there's something of a virtuous circle in that as we do it together. Right, final bit we're going to move on to. So I think I just want to look at some contemporary ideas now. We've done an awful lot in this time, and I know it's been pretty. You've probably been saturated in ideas, but we're just going to look at one more thing, one more concept, and that's actually drawing from psychology. And I'm interested in what modern developments in psychology can mirror to us as we look at the Christian community, and particularly the development of positive psychology in the last probably 15 years or so, 15 to 20. And a number of people are known for this. Psychologist called Martin Seligman is the person that started it. He's not a Christian, although he has a lot of Christian sympathies. There are Christian positive psychologists. One I can point you to would be Robert Emmons, who's done some brilliant work on gratitude, really fantastic work on him. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this is because there was a movement in psychology where they realized that people were really good at naming the problem. They were really good at saying, oh, this is the dysfunction in this individual, and this is how we treat it. But psychology seemed less good at saying, well, what works? What's actually good? What are the things that we do that are helpful? And so they started looking at the patterns of lives of people that were flourishing. They started looking globally at this, did really expensive studies at what are the ways that people can live well? What are the ways in which people seem to live longer, live more happily, seem to develop more of a sense of kind of contentment in their lives? What does that look like? And so they broke these things down into components, and they looked at these ideas and they said, well, okay, I think there are basically 5 elements to this that seem to kind of break down into people who are living the most kind of fulfilled lives. And the first of these is that they're people who regularly experience positive emotions. That's a daily thing. That there are, part of their usual experience is that the positivity, there's pleasure in their life, you can name that. It might be temporary, but they experience positive emotions. The other thing that they often experience is this idea of engagement, and that they're people who are, they're regularly involved. They kind of, they don't just sit back, but they put themselves into stuff. Engagement. There's development, and there are projects. The other thing that was really key, and that's relationships, which will not be a surprise. And people are not just relationships, but meaningful relationships, good connection. And then also meaning. Meaning was another area, and I'll put up a little mnemonic in a moment that we'll read this through, so you'll be able to see it shortly. So meaning was very important as well. So it wasn't just that these people had all these things going on for them, but they felt they were part of something bigger and often deeply transcendent. So it wasn't just kind of, they were part of the local social club and they drew meaning from that, but actually there was a sense of the divine often for most of these people. Yeah. And then as well as that, they were able to experience achievement. So they'd be able to commit to things, and they would see them develop skills. They'd see things change as a result of what they did. And so here we end up with this little mnemonic called PARMA. So this is what the positive psychologists formed. And it's quite a neat little way of trying to understand how this development worked. And again, it's a really interesting idea, this idea of psychology moving away from pathology, dysfunction, and more looking at kind of, well, what works, what's actually good for us. And perhaps this idea of kind of life satisfaction is an ongoing process of fresh challenges, not just a state that's given, but something that's, an ongoing piece of work. And for me, that seems really, really interesting, and in terms of mirroring that back to the Christian community, in terms of what we can gain from looking at this learning within positive psychology. Because I think, and I don't know if you'll agree, but I think that as I look at that mnemonic and look at those different elements there, that you start to see a number of different things that might be present within a kind of a thriving Christian life. That if we weren't working too hard, we'd probably be able to say, well, I think we probably could aspire to most of those things, in terms of a community that's healthy. And again, I don't want to say this is the model we should be working to as the body of Christ, but it's just a way of mirroring back from some of this evidence base that has been done through these scientific methods that I think I hope might give us a bit more confidence in terms of the kind of, as it were, the flourishing life that we might be developing and wanting to aspire to as a community It's not our job to make people happy, but it can be a really good byproduct. I think you'll agree. You know, this idea of a flourishing life is more than just superficial happiness. And the thing is, a lot of these things take work, don't they? It takes work to do that. And some of these things, it may be things that we, by nature, we're gifted with. Others we're not, you know. And again, within the context of a community and a dynamic community, we might be able to see what those things look like. So I guess maybe a question just to look at, maybe and to take away, is this idea of, you know, if we were to think about our community right now, and if we're thinking about the fact that we're in lockdown right now, what would be for us our priorities in terms of well-being? You know, there may be long-term things that have to be on hold at the moment, but if there are any elements of these elements of well-being that we would want to try and pursue and explore as part of our life, living as the body of Christ, are the things that we would want to kind of uphold and explore with others. So it's just something to kind of think about as we I know we've dug into quite a broad range of thinking around this. So I know that within this time we've sort of scratched the surface of lots of different things, but I hope that we have been able to dig into something that's something in this that's offered each one of us something good to go with. So I'm just going to bounce back again, sharing the screen one more time, just for a last time, back to this, and just thinking about what we were feeling when we looked at that image first of all, and thinking about the journey that we may have travelled on just within the last 20 minutes or so of kind of thinking of that rich desire that God has for us to flourish, and the ways that's expressed in his word, and the way in which in turn we are invited into being involved in coming alongside him and participating in being in his kingdom in the way that he's made it to be, in a grace-dependent way, in a spirit-fueled way. This idea of our flourishing being part of something that comes out from who he is. And I guess that's the thing to leave with, really, that we've been given a lot here. We continue to be given lots. And you know, as we consider, even within these times where we are pared down, that's a reality. You know, many of us will be coming into this call today feeling exhausted, and I'm very aware of that. You know, the stretches of the time in ministry. Perhaps again, it's time to get back to that question of kind of what's really important right now. What are the ways in which we, as our community, can tap into this vision of flourishing that God has for our world? So thank you for the time. I really appreciate it. That's me. If you want to make a note of that, then I'm really happy to contact you. That's our website and Sanctuary, and there are various resources about mental health up there. A bit more from me later on the question of COVID and grief, so we're going to dig into that a little bit more. And I know that Naomi's going to do some more practical work with us around wellbeing as we think about it for ourselves individually. But I hope that at least has given you a bit of a taster and some things to kind of channel down and investigate as you explore what wellbeing looks like for your community through a biblical lens.